Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Well, this was the week that changed the world. Russia invaded Ukraine unprovoked and unjustified, without any threat by Ukraine to Russia. We're in a major war that is escalating every day with the humanitarian consequences that are quite extreme. We're going to look at all of this by looking at how the West is responding, what is the impact on Russia and Vladimir Putin standing at home, and how does this all affect what is happening in China. Joining us this week from Kenya, James Harding, founder and editor-in-chief of Tortoise Media. James, wonderful to have you. From Connecticut, Bobby Ghosh, who is opinion editor at Bloomberg Opinion. Bobby, great to have you. And from Washington, D.C., Susan Glasser, staff writer at The New Yorker and longtime analyst of all things Russia and all things U.S. politics. Susan, wonderful to have you back as well. James, let's start with you. The week that changed the world. We saw this weekend a speech by Olaf Scholz in the Bundestag that it was quite remarkable. And just a series of speeches that sort of reset how I think Europe, in some ways more than the United States, is taking a different look, although, of course, President Biden in the State of the Union also addressed this issue. How do you think the West has responded, and what's most remarkable in your mind?
So, Ivo, thank you. And it's difficult, isn't it, to think about it, the extent to which we actually feel it, the fear and the worry in this particular case. I can remember a few moments, but they're few. And I think you're completely right to call it as the week that changed the world. If you like, last week was that sense of Europe being revisited by its worst history, this massing of troops on the Russian border with Ukraine, Putin, the dictator who was humiliating his flunkies and jailing dissidents, but it all seemed so reminiscent of Poland in '39. And then the troops rolled over and it was Ukraine in 2022. But this week, I do think it's a week that's changed the world, but from a different start point, 1990. I think that the assumptions of the post-Cold War period collapsed this week. And I just point to three things. You pointed to one, Germany, but I'll just do three in order if I might. I spoke to a very senior military figure in the UK, and I asked him what must be an obvious question to probably many, many listeners, which is, when you look at that convoy of tanks and trucks and artillery, why doesn't someone just bomb it? And his answer was, Ukraine doesn't have the weapons capability to get through Russian airspace to bomb it, even though this is in just 30 kilometers north of Kiev now. But I said, why doesn't the West bomb it? And he said, nuclear arsenal, both short range and intercontinental ballistic missiles, but most importantly, that Russia's military, a nuclear strike by Russia could be seen within its context as a defense of the state itself and a de-escalation, i.e. it would force a pause in the fighting. And he said military figures in the UK within NATO are genuinely fearful of that. They think it's implausible, but they don't think it's impossible. And so I think the first point is to say that we've long thought that the nature of the nuclear standoff between East and West was defended through the argument of mutually assured destruction. But what we're actually seeing this week is that the threat of Vladimir Putin's nuclear arsenal is actually deterring a conventional weapons attack that would defend innocent people and civilians. It's a very significant moment in rethinking the West. And then the two things I think that flow from that, Ivo, and I'll say them very briefly, Germany and Switzerland. Germany essentially coming to the conclusion that 75 years of post-Second World War pacifism has made it a bystander to aggression. And Switzerland, the home of private banking, saying that actually neutrality is no longer feasible. Both countries, Germany and Switzerland, have overturned historic commitments to pacifism and neutrality in order to defend their neighbors and democracy. And what that says to me is that, on the one hand, led by Germany, we're going to see rearmament in Europe, right? And led by Switzerland, we're going to see the private sector conscripted into this war. And those are two profound changes from a period of optimism and globalization.
Smart, James. Absolutely. Susan, you've written already about the U.S. response to President's speech and the State of the Union. How much do you think the situation has changed, also in Europe, but also how do you see it in the United States? Is this the week that changed the world, including the United States?
I do. I think your framing is absolutely right in the sense that it's not possible anymore to speak of a return to the status quo ante. It is, just like September 1st, 1939 was the last day of that era. There was literally no possibility to return to it. We will never go back to the world of January 2022. And now, in my view, actually, we've had this conversation before on this, a wonderful program of yours, Ivo. And, my view was that once Vladimir Putin deployed an invasion army of 190,000 people, and I said that the last time I was on here before the war, there was no going back. But of course, there were a lot of people in denial right up until the moment when Putin made his intentions crystal clear. In Washington, unlike in Germany, there has been more clear-eyed view of Vladimir Putin, I think, for some time. There has not necessarily been a clear-eyed, kind of strategic response to Vladimir Putin. And Ivo has seen that up front in many ways. And tragedies like this have many authors and are many, many years in the making. But I think from the point of view of reorientation, Washington has been more clear about Vladimir Putin actually than some of the countries closer to Vladimir Putin. We've all had many experiences of being in Berlin and engaging with people who really just couldn't bear to see the facts that were staring them in the eye when it came to Putin. So in that sense, it feels like a bigger revolution in the actual foreign policy of Europe. But for the United States, the implications are profound, and I think we have not fully come to terms with them. You see that in the messaging of Biden's State of the Union, which was very strong in castigating Vladimir Putin, but essentially not yet willing to communicate with Americans, perhaps because of our own enormous political divisions and Biden's political weakness at the moment. His line was, we're all going to be okay, which is, to try to walk people off of this cliff of nuclear panic and World War III panic that you start to see happening. But I want to echo what James is saying. Some of the conversations that I've been privy to this week are absolutely hair-raising when it comes to really being forced to confront for the first time in my lifetime with, what is Russia's nuclear doctrine? And to have people who've been really closely following it say, well, listen, every year in the Zapad exercises, Zapad means West in Russian, every year, escalation to the use of tactical nuclear weapons has been a part of those exercises. It is part of Russian military doctrine in the way that James suggests. Now, the way in which the Russians have gamed out use of nuclear weapons, their red line has been like actual invasion of Russian territory by NATO and therefore defense of Russia itself. So we're not in that situation right now. Russia has invaded another country. It's not Russia, number one. Number two, it's not clear how prepared Russia is to actually carry out that kind of an escalation, even if it's part of their military doctrine. But number three, and what's really scary to me, I think, as part of this is, what about in a situation where Putin believes that NATO is at war with him, even if we say that we're not? The sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, it seems, are very clearly economic war, in which the end state goal can only be the toppling of the Putin regime or the making of Russia a completely pariah state in the international economy in a way that does constitute arguably a declaration of war. Putin may consider our delivery of weapons to the Ukrainians and support for those weapons and real-time intelligence to constitute acts of war against Russia. Further, Putin is deep into a historical fever dream in which Ukraine is not a legitimate independent nation and not a legitimate people. And if you take that logic, and the Soviet mindset that he comes out of is very legalistic, if you take that logic, then therefore, actually, Ukraine is already a part of Russia, as Vladimir Putin believes it. This is not about, Putin operating in Syria anymore. He has told us that he believes Ukraine is a part of Russia. Therefore, he may easily, it seems to me, make the leap that we are at war with him in Russia itself. And so already there's an incredible murkiness, which is why there's so much danger inherent to this conflict. It's why you've seen a very restrained message from Biden at a moment when, world public opinion is so strongly on the Ukrainian side. There's demands to do more and do more and do more. And it's reminiscent to me very quicker than I could have imagined, actually, Ivo. We're already in this situation where, remember at the end of the Cold War and the Soviet Union is breaking apart, where George H.W. Bush and Jim Baker were actually being criticized for being too restrained. But their great fear was, unfortunately, the situation we find ourselves in right now, which was a weakened and backed into a corner nuclear superpower, feeling like America was, hastening its demise. And we're going to be wanting that restraint, it seems to me, a lot. But it's going to be really hard to maintain that politically because unlike at the end of the Cold War, we are all experiencing this war firsthand and the horror of it on our phones and on our TVs every minute. And it's awful and traumatic. And European publics and the American public are participants in this war in a way, that it really is without precedent. And they're going to be demanding more and more action by President Biden that, risks escalation.
I think you're painting a dire picture, but I think it's an accurate one, and that's unfortunate. Bobby, the world has changed. How do you see what's most remarkable about the week, and how much should we worry about this escalation that both James and Susan talked about in terms of how the restraint or non-restraint on the part of the West economically, but also militarily. U.S. weapons and Finnish weapons and Swedish weapons are killing Russians, used by Ukrainian forces, of course. How much should we worry about that? You're still muted, Bobby.
We have whole new things to worry about now, even in the past 24 hours. To pick up from what both James and Susan said, the nuclear threat, there's a new dimension to the nuclear threat, is there not? We've learned in the past 24 hours that Putin does not have to unsheath his nuclear weapons in order to threaten nuclear catastrophe for Europe. He can point his shells at any number of nuclear facilities within Eastern Europe. And this attack on Europe's biggest nuclear power facility just last night should have said, I'm sure it did send shivers down all kinds of spines in Washington and in Brussels and in every capital in Europe. And you have to wonder how much of that was the calculation. I'm sure the big part of the calculation was to try and knock down Ukraine's electricity supply. That one plant, I believe, produces 23% of Ukraine's electricity, and so knocking it off means that it inflicts real pain on Ukraine. But you have to wonder what part of the calculation was, well, we'll send this chill down European spines by attacking a nuclear facility, even if it's a civilian one, it still raises the threats. It's going to be harder and harder to respond to this with restraint, because on the other side there seems to be none. And I think Susan's exactly right. The fact that this war is being experienced close at hand, this close at hand on our phones, has a magnifying effect both on individuals but also on our politicians. Our politicians, our political leaders, are experiencing it like that themselves, but they also know that we are, and they can't but be conscious of the heightened emotions around this war. So that's something that did not exist in 1989. And it did exist in 2014, but not to the degree it does now. So with every passing year, these things are coming closer and closer into our brains. There is economic war now. There can be no question that Russia is under economic assault. The stock market is closed again today. The ruble has collapsed. These are very warlike situations. Never mind that the oligarchs are having their super yachts taken away from them. We can all derive a certain amount of schadenfreude from that. But ordinary Russians are not experiencing it in that way. They don't care whether Abramovich has lost the Chelsea Football Club. They're worried about breadlines, and they're worried about their savings vanishing. So it won't be hard for Putin to convince Russians that they are in a state of war. And then he can sort of feed off of that while feeding it both ways, and give himself license to respond in any way that he would like. So yeah, be afraid, be very, very afraid.
The French, I think it was the French finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, who said that our goal is to collapse the Russian economy. That is about as close a declaration of economic warfare as you possibly can. James, you want to jump in, and then I want to get to Russia and Putin.
No, I just think there's something, while I was listening to Susan and Bob, I was thinking and reflecting, Ivo, on the piece that you've written for Foreign Affairs. I scribbled down P5, and I was thinking to myself, I lived through a period of time where the threats to our security came largely outside of the P5, right? That the permanent members of the Security Council had different relationships and alliances, but they weren't threatening each other as directly as they do today. And it then made me think that, of course, to an extent since 1990, we've had a holiday from those hostilities, right? That's not been a normal state of affairs. And the reason I mention that in the context of the piece you wrote, Ivo, is that I'm talking about the piece for Foreign Affairs on the return of containment. And the reason I think that there is something there, and, sparing your blushes, I think it's one of the few, if not the only, actually seriously constructive pieces of writing about this in the last week, is that we are back in the world of George Kennan. We are trying to think through what's a different architecture for dealing with the world. And it seems to me, and that's why you're right, that's the week the world changed, is that all of us can now see the set of problems and see it with some fear. What do you build in response? And, just to take forward, the arguments that you make, kind of paraphrased, the US has to be strong, Russia has to be cut off economically and isolated politically. It feels to me as though two or three elements of that are really difficult for the West. Changing NATO's posture, moving thousands, tens of thousands of troops along that Russian border is a different kind of military leadership than we've seen on continental Europe for a generation. Strangely enough, keeping the US focused on Europe for more than a week is going to be a challenge, right? It hasn't had that kind of, policy concentration. And strangely, I think that we're going to find that the West is actually deeply divided, and I mean at the kind of upper echelons of policymakers and business leaders, on the issue of deglobalization. How far is the West really willing to say, okay, we spent 30 years building brands and businesses and relationships in countries like Russia and China. We're actually going to move to a different kind of hemispheric economy. It's very unclear to me what kind of support that in European capitals and in the US, you're going to get to that?
Well, those I think are the questions we're going to be facing on in the weeks and months ahead. And the point of the piece that I wrote was basically say that we really got to think conceptually differently than we have in the last 30 years. And I picking up on your first point you just made, James, is for the last 30 years, conflict in the world has been internal to states that then spreads. That there's something happening internal. There's a massive humanitarian crisis, what have you. There's a dictator who's ruling in ways, and that or weapons of mass destruction that are being built. Now we go back to a very traditional way of conflict: one country invading another. Which we haven't seen in a long time, and we need to adjust our policies for it. Susan, I mean, the key, of course, and you know this as well as anyone in the world, and have been warning about it for the world, is the person who started it all. And I think, therefore, the key, in part, to the solution of this is to find a way for Putin to get out of the situation he has put himself in, or for us to help him to get to that point, or frankly, for a change in regime. Talk a little bit about how the week has changed the internal dynamics in Russia itself, particularly Putin and his standing on power. Is he weaker? Is he stronger? Is he more paranoid, less paranoid, more cornered, less cornered? How do you think, if he were lying on the couch in your study there, what he would be telling you? Okay, forget about that. Forget about the couch because that's unfair. But how do you think the week has really changed him?
Well, that's right. I mean, you say that. Actually, I was discussing, my husband and I were in Moscow for 4 years at the beginning of Putin's tenure, and actually Peter and I were discussing, well, what would you do, if you were sitting here in our house in Washington in 1939 or 1941 and you knew what was going to happen? What would you want to make sure that you had done besides, kill Hitler in the crib? Not an option available to most of us, right? Look, Putin is in trouble, but that doesn't mean, that he's been made weaker by all of the week's developments. And that, again, is very disconcerting and very scary. In fact, I think you're seeing play out. I was saying for days, hard to get people's attention because war is so dramatic, and, the television and the horrible images of what's happening in Ukraine, but that really, Putin is radically changing two countries at once with his war, Russia and Ukraine. And the domestic repression and the crackdown, that we're seeing now, it's not unanticipated. That is a part of the war. It is a feature of the war, not a bug. The new Iron Curtain that has swiftly descended, more than we could even possibly imagine how quickly it's descended, is because of the Western sanctions. But Putin did anticipate that, perhaps not to the full extent. He was prepared to use this to consolidate even more power in himself and in the Kremlin, and to eliminate the remaining vestiges of Russians' freedoms. That has clearly been a part of the methodical agenda of Putin that we've seen playing out in particular over the last year, and that I think went hand in hand with the preparations for the invasion of Ukraine. And just to be clear, I don't think you plan an invasion force like that and of this size. He didn't decide to do this at the end of August because America screwed up the withdrawal from Afghanistan. First of all, people have sort of forgotten this or willfully, ignored it. But America actually said 2 years ago during the Trump administration, in February of 2020, America announced that it was going to be pulling out of Afghanistan more or less when it did. So that was a long time coming. Certainly, I do think there's an overall view that Putin has of American weakness, which has absolutely shaped many of his actions over the last few years. American division and weakness, and not going just to the last year, but I would, point people to Putin's interview with Lionel Barber, then the editor of the Financial Times, a couple years ago, in which he announced the failure and collapse of the Western liberal international order. And he basically said, now is our time, the time of the dictators. And why were we not listening? Why did his neighbors, Ukraine understood this, but has its own enormous problems and, lack of stature on the world, and were being blackmailed by the previous American president. So to get back to your question, Putin, we've all seen his extreme and increasing isolation, even from his own advisors, that can't be explained purely by COVID. A week ago Monday, when he, essentially ripped off the final remaining uncertainty and, convened his National Security Council, for this kind of set piece theater, that showed us, somebody said to me, it's like like one of the scenes that got left on the cutting room floor from the death of Stalin. I mean, you had Putin in this huge hall in the Kremlin, his senior national security advisors, the heads of the military and the foreign intelligence agencies sitting 30 feet away from him. They didn't even raid a table. They literally are just sitting in small, uncomfortable chairs while he berates them into saying what he wants them to say. And that visual, really was meant to communicate to a Russian audience as well as to an international one. There is only one man who matters. I thought it was very Stalinist, as have all his appearances actually been. He is using increasingly also the language explicitly of 20th century totalitarianism when it comes to the dehumanization of Ukrainians as a people and as a country. When he talks about denazification, when he says they're not real and they must be exterminated, this is the language of genocide. And by the way, Putin has launched many wars before. He has not. That is a difference. I do not recall him using language like this before. It is messianic. It is fascistic. It is something different in that sense, or an escalation from Putin in a way that suggests he may have more unchallenged power vested in him right now than actually in the late Soviet system, which was much more a Politburo collective leadership. So when we talk about Kremlinology in the Soviet era, right, you have this image of guys at the CIA sitting there and counting, who's sitting where at the May Day parade. But that's also because it mattered who sat where at the May Day parade. What's really scary here is that it doesn't seem to matter who sits where at the May Day parade because it's just Putin's parade. And I've heard an increasingly, also, I think Americans and Europeans are starting, unfortunately, to understand this in a visceral way. How can one man launch a war? I've had this question repeatedly in interviews in the last few days. And, Joe Biden, actually, to his credit, was very clear from the beginning of his presidency, not so clear about what to do about Putin. He was wrong about Putin, but he was right that this is a new age geopolitically of conflict between the West and democracies and autocracies. He was right about that. And I don't think strategically there was a willingness in Washington and especially in Europe to understand what those consequences were, to do the thinking that you're urging in your foreign affairs piece.
In that sense, this is not a week that changed the world, because it's really a 22-year period of Putin having come to power back in late 1999, and its evolution that has been there. And there have been a few clear-eyed folks, but many who haven't, in the U.S. and others. Bobby, when you look at what's happening inside Russia right now, how do you think things have changed, if at all? And I guess the real question is there a way out short of absolute victory or absolute defeat? You're still on mute, Bobby.
That is a very difficult question to address in the context that we find ourselves. What does absolute victory or defeat look like even? And our definitions of these things are very different from Putin's. I wonder, when Susan was reminding us of that incredible scene from that sort of staged meeting in that giant hall, who would want to be in the shoes of that intelligence chief this week? Last week, he was being berated in front of an international audience for daring to take a slightly different point of view than Putin. This week, he has to answer for the obvious intelligence failures that have led to the Russian military advance essentially slowed down or stalled outside of Kiev. I'm sure Putin will be asking even tougher questions, putting feet almost literally to the fire within the close group about why that has happened. He will want to ascribe blame, and some people will not be sleeping very easy tonight or getting anywhere close to windows on high floors. The thing that remains unchanged is that Putin has complete dominance of internal messaging. So the Russian perception of what is going on is hard to fathom. We're always, and Susan will know this far better than I, how much do Russians appreciate that what they are getting on their television screens and on their computer screens is propaganda? How much of it are they prepared to believe? How much do they immediately, as soon as they see it, how much do they disregard? And do ordinary Russians make any special effort to look past the official propaganda and look to other places online for alternative sources of information? It's impossible to tell. I can't trust any polling that comes out of Russia, because we know the Russians are very suspicious of pollsters with very good reason, and may not be giving us a clear view of their opinions. So it's really hard to know. And of course, you add to that the other dimension, which you mentioned, I think, Ivo, which is that Putin himself is completely isolated. I don't think he even cares about opinion polls of Russians, whether or not he believes them. He's making these decisions almost entirely by himself, with little consideration for other people's opinions. So the perceptions, as a result, the perceptions of what constitutes victory and what constitutes defeat are very blurry. Now, if we want to look at a glass half full, there we could say that allows Putin almost at any point in the continuum to declare victory, because nobody has defined it. He can make it up as he goes along, and he can say at any point, "I've won," and then he can walk away from it. Only I've seen no indication that he's preparing himself or preparing anybody for that eventuality. He has had opportunities, even in this past week, to do that, but he doesn't seem to be taking it. We've always assumed that this whole doctrine of escalating to de-escalate, that all of Putin's actions in the past couple of months has been towards that end, to escalate in order to de-escalate. What if we're wrong? We've been wrong about a whole bunch of other things.
I think we were wrong.
Yeah. What if he wants to keep escalating? Exactly right.
So
what if he wants to keep escalating beyond this to the next, to Moldova, to Latvia? We don't know.
Right. I think, in fact, it's a fallacy to say that that word should just not be appearing with people. And I think it's been one of the most irresponsible aspects of the commentary, to be honest. Like, there is nothing in Putin's history to suggest that, number one. Number two, he has stipulated a goal, and it is to take over all of Ukraine. He has actually now said that publicly, and he's repeated that to Macron and to other interlocutors. So his goal is not to de-escalate. His goal is to conquer his neighbor, and then we'll see. And then just to one point, because I'm so glad, Bobby, that you made this point about what do Russians think. I was just looking, as you were saying, I happened to stumble on an article from a young woman in Kharkiv whose mom is in Russia and doesn't believe that she's under attack, and she's literally being shelled, and 4 people died where she is, and she's been continuously bombarded. Her own mother believes Russian state television over her. And I think that, propaganda works, and it has worked on the Russian people. And part of the reason Putin didn't even feel the need to prepare the groundwork in leading up to the invasion, except for the week before, was because he was confident in his model of propaganda and control of the Russian people. And I think that Americans who were seeing a few thousand Russians in the liberal cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg, which have been opposed to Putin actually for more than a decade, already in a state of opposition, it's understandable, but it's kind of reminiscent in a way of like the American enthusiasm for the, kind of revolution in Egypt or in Syria in its early stages, and our ability to underestimate the brutality of dictators and to think that they're going to act to de-escalate a bad situation, but of their own making. Like, I think that we fall into this trap again and again. So anyways, I'm done.
No, I want to bring James in, and I also want to keep a few minutes to talk about China. But James, jump in here.
Fun enough, actually, that was exactly what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to say, if you wanted to stick, Ivo, with your theme of a week that changed the world, what I would be most hopeful of, and this is perhaps naive, in fact, it is naive, that President Biden says, I've asked Antony Blinken to go to Beijing tomorrow. That is the most significant single thing that the US could do right now. Because I thought that the part of this was in your piece, and I think the people who've really judged this right have observed the fact that China abstained on the UN resolution. That's definitely less than Russia would have wanted, but it is consistent with China's position around this kind of territorial aggression. And I think there is, in the kind of week that changed the world context, a moment here where the West and the US in particular has to ask itself the question, and I say this as someone who lived and worked in China, has an enormous fondness of China, so you may have to aim off my thinking on this, but whether or not the extent of its hawkishness, and I am clearly, I have very strong views on what's happening in Xinjiang and Hong Kong and Taiwan, but the kind of systemic hawkishness of the US position and the extent to which it's demanded the same of all of its allies has put its most important partner in dealing with Russia at too far a distance to work constructively together. And I think there needs to be a substantial act that brings US and China together around this, but it's going to have to start with something symbolic.
Great opening, because I think this is the next big play and maybe the next week. Bobby, the Chinese reaction is interesting. Not once, 3 times they've now abstained at the UN, one in the General Assembly, one in the Security Council, and the Human Rights Commission just yesterday on Russia. They are not siding with Russia on this issue. Yet they had this remarkable meeting between Xi and Putin just a month ago.
Which no limits, they said.
So how do you see it, and what's the opening?
Well, there is an opening, and Biden needs to grab it. I take a slightly different view from James, which is that, yes, there is a systemic anti-Chinese sentiment in the American political system, but equally there is one in China. It's taken 2 hands to clap on that. And we've not yet seen any indication that the Chinese want to change that particular equation. But, there have been some reports that China was aware that this offensive was coming, and that had an input into the timing, that Putin deliberately waited until the end of the Olympics. I'm very skeptical of those reports myself, because there's nothing in the Chinese response that suggests that they had pre-knowledge. They will if that is indeed the case, they're much better actors than I would have given them credit for, because their response was so muddled. They didn't have the language ready. They were clearly taken by surprise. The way they responded the first day, the second day, the third, never mind questions about bringing the Chinese, the large number of Chinese stuck in the middle of all of this conflict, bringing them out or making arrangements to bring them out of the conflict zone. The Chinese had not done any preparation for that. They hadn't prepared their press releases. They hadn't coordinated the language that they would use to describe this. And so I am skeptical. I think I would take the view that Xi Jinping finds himself in a fairly uncomfortable place right now. And I think the Biden administration's decision to keep pushing this, to keep forcing the Chinese to express themselves on this issue at every possible forum. There's another United Nations General Assembly debate that's being lined up. There's a Human Rights Commission discussion that's going to come up, and China will constantly be put in a place where it is either required to abstain or come up with somewhat more nuanced language. That's exactly the right thing to do. But it will take more than that. It will take somebody important in Washington getting on a plane, going to Beijing, and opening a real conversation. Absent that, I don't think it
sorry.
works.
Susan doesn't quite see it the same way. Well, I think because you were vigorously shaking your head. So Susan, go ahead.
Well, I mean, first of all, let's just say that it would be malpractice if China was surprised by this invasion, and they would have to fire their entire intelligence apparatus. So I 100% do not accept that in any way. Not only did Putin and Xi meet and sign a 5,000-word declaration 2 weeks before the invasion, but the United States was sharing real-time intelligence that any intelligence service worth its 2 cents that isn't completely subject to purging would know. I'm sorry, but it was not a surprise that Russia invaded Ukraine. And you can say that people fooled themselves or whatever, but it's not the job of intelligence agencies and governments, to not believe that. There is no history of having 190,000 person invasion force go to its neighbors' borders with the capacities that the Russians brought there and simply turn around and go home. That is just not, like, anyone who believed that is not a serious leader. I'm not talking about, the political discourse around it and, Putin's lies, which were effective in a variety of ways, actually, and giving himself the space, to make a final determination. And we don't know yet, obviously, a lot that history will tell us about, when exactly and what exactly was said between Putin and Xi. And I don't claim to know any of those things, but just as a pure matter of statecraft, that is not consistent with anything that we know about Xi Jinping as a leader, who is very methodical, has actually operated with a very clear-eyed view, both of the world and particularly of Russia. And that's the one other thing I just wanted to throw out there for folks as we think about it. And again, I don't claim any, great, inside knowledge of this, but I have observed over a couple decades China's attitude toward Russia, and it's very disdainful. So where I do, absolutely agree with everybody is that it's put Xi in a place that he probably not want to be in. Putin's almost messianic behavior is obviously very problematic in a partner. Again, just to the military piece, guys, Putin moved major chunks of his forces from the Far East along the Chinese border to be a part of this invasion. There's no way, that would be a malpractice from a Russian security standpoint to have done that, without there being some level of mutual understanding here. But again, even if there was no pre-knowledge, and I can't speak to that report in the New York Times, whether it's accurate or not, but even if they didn't discuss it at their meeting in Beijing, Xi's own intelligence would have been clear cut on this. And I do think that they think that Russia screwed up the end of the Soviet Union, and that Gorbachev basically was an idiot. And they describe the Russian path as the path they don't want to take. And I wouldn't be surprised if now there's a modern version of that, of feeling that Putin has screwed up, including possibly their plans for Taiwan.
We got about a minute left, and I want to give Bobby and James both an opportunity to jump in here quickly. I would say it is possible that the Russians, like the Chinese, believe their own propaganda about the weakness of the West and are totally surprised by the fact that didn't come about, or indeed that Ukraine would crumble within a minute. Which is what many people believe. So in that sense, it's not quite, even if you knew, you didn't necessarily knew what was going to happen this week. Bobby, final word, and James.
Well, I think I'll go back to where we started. The world has changed. The big question is how much has China's view of the world changed in all of this? And I think that will be the crucial determinant of what happens next week, both from Biden's point of view and from Putin's point of view. If China believes the world has changed and adjusts its frames accordingly, that is going to inform how we move forward or not in Ukraine.
Exactly. James.
I just wanted to say, I think the opportunity for the West is the mutual mistrust between China and Russia. This is historic. If George Ken and Ivo were here, I suspect he would be saying, these are two communist parties of old that don't like each other and don't trust each other. And so it's in keeping with China's position on Russia to abstain and take a very skeptical view of what Russia's doing.
Well, on the 50th anniversary of Nixon going to Beijing to meet with Mao Zedong, this is probably a good note to remember that sometimes the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and that allows you to give you rooms of maneuver. If that happens, we will discuss it here next week on World Review. I want to thank James Harding, Bobby Ghosh, and Susan Glasser for a really terrific insight into a very, very, very difficult situation. But I think you've all shown light on the issues that are before us. So thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in to World Review. We'll be back next week for another edition of World Review. And until then, bon weekend, and hope that some of the darkest predictions you've heard here today will not come to pass. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.